Great. Welcome to the third episode of the Sirpambile Youth Webinar Series. And this one's called Violence Against Women and Girls in Marginalised Communities. I'm really glad to be here with you and look forward to a productive and insightful discussion. This webinar follows a structured format, beginning with the panelists, each giving a little bit of input on the topic, and then Rachel will provide some overarching comments and reflections. We'll then move on to an open question and answer session where you're welcome to ask questions via the chat box. Please be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Sirpambile Youth YouTube channel. This is where you can catch up on webinars you may have missed. We're excited to have such a great turnout today. Please continue to introduce yourselves and engage in the chat box. And don't hesitate to use the chat box for any questions at any time throughout the webinar. Questions for the panelists can be added to the chat box throughout their talks, and they'll be addressed later. So just to give a little bit of background, marginalised communities experience exceedingly high levels of violence against women and girls, driven by the historical kind of social, economic and political exclusion. In 2020, the Sirpambile Youth Project launched in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, aiming to investigate the impact of this marginalisation on young people's well-being and to develop interventions to tackle these issues head-on. These issues continue to be a cause for concern in South Africa and globally. In this webinar, we'll reflect on this through case studies in South Africa on young people living in informal settlements and rural communities, and also with women in slums in India. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, a panel of specialists. I'll briefly introduce each one of them now, and then they'll be able to speak in turn. So we'll start off with Sibile Kaula. His topic's going to be on understanding men's perpetration of violence in informal settlements in Durban, South Africa. And he's the operations manager at Project Empower. Then we'll have Nwabisa Jamashai. She'll be speaking about the social context of violence against women and girls among young people in South Africa. And she is a specialist researcher in the Gender and Health Research Unit at SAMRC. Then we'll be turning to India, to Dr. Nireen Daruwala, where she'll be talking about her work in India, in slums, around violence against women, specifically focused on Mumbai. And she's Programme Director for Prevention of Violence Against Women and Children, Research Partnership and Scaling at SNEHA. Finally, the discussant will be Professor Rachel Jukes, and she is the Executive Scientist at the SAMRC in South Africa. I'd like to invite each panelist to start this discussion with a brief scene setter by giving some insight into this topic based on their background and experiences. So I'll turn to Sibile to start up. So Sibile, over to you. You need to unmute yourself, unfortunately.
Okay.
Perfect.
Let me share my screen again. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gibbs. My name is Sibile Kaula, as you already introduced me. My presentation today is understanding men's perpetration of violence in informal settlements in Durban, South Africa. So here I'm going to be talking about the informal settlements around eThekwini, the structural factors that might cause violence in these areas and the historical background of violence in KZN, and also about young men's view or how they see the causes of violence in their lives. So it is estimated that we have over 1 billion people living in informal settlements worldwide, And then there's about 500 informal settlements in eThekwini, which is housing more than a quarter of the population. So people kind of move into these places to get closer to economic and educational opportunities. Some are moving into for freedom or independence, to get away from maybe their families and extended families. So and also affordability, because informal settlements are quite closer to cities. So we did a small survey with young men in eThekwini in 2020, about 80 young men living in informal settlements around Durban. So the outcomes of that small surveys that we did was that they showed a lot of poor mental health, extreme food insecurity, high levels of alcohol and drug use, and then 37% of them reported IPV perpetration, and also a high percentage of about 47% of men who said that they have reported violence towards other men. So in the Siya Phambili Youth, which is the name of the project that we are talking about today, we were focusing on these young men to try and co-develop an intervention that resonates with what young people needed, and also focusing on their mental health, reduce the perpetration of IPV, and also violence in general in their lives. And also to understand from them what needs to be done to make their lives better. So we went through different activities with them, such as artifacts collection, where they shared their daily activities, like daily lives, through photos via WhatsApp. Research team did analysis after we did the interviews around the artifacts, and we did character creation, where people develop different characters in their communities. And we developed a theory of change, which was a way of shaping how the intervention would look like and how it can be delivered in their communities. So for the sake of this, we are focusing on this red square things. So after speaking with the young men, we were trying to find out what are the causes of violence in their lives. So most spoke about history of violence in their lives, being abused or physically disciplined as children by their parents or elders, seeing perpetration of violence between parents and elders in their communities, lack of uncertainty in their relationship, maybe jealousy and cheating. So young men saw that lack of work, since there's high unemployment in these communities, it makes them unable to provide in these relationships, because their partners might be looking for them to kind of give some provisions financially. They're also worried that their girlfriend might leave them because maybe they would find someone who's a better provider, or who's better better financially compared to them. They also said that another problem is cheating on their side, because they find casual partners, or the people that they cheat with, they bring much less stress and more exciting, because they are not living with them. It is just like going out and, you know, having fun for that time. And those people are not like demanding as a person that they are in a relationship, like most of the time. They also spoke about the influence of friends, that even though it is not a written contract that it should be, but friends report if they see a girlfriend doing something or with another man, and also advise them on the next step that should be taken in order to sort out that problem, which include maybe violence or confronting the girlfriend. And then there's also some pressure in these friendship groups to have multiple partners. So if the group is accustomed to having multiple partners, then everyone in that group, there's pressure to have multiple partners, and they are struggling to challenge that because they might be kicked out of the group or excluded from the group activities or on that friendship cycle. They also mentioned alcohol and drugs. So men saw drinking as a way of dealing with stress and challenges that they are faced with. So they'd rather spend time with their friends drinking than going back home and facing a girlfriend who would be demanding some kind of financial support of which they don't have. However, it also creates a problem because they also fight in those drinking spots with other men or over maybe other women or over women. Yes. So, and also they saw that women saw it as that men are wasting money by going and drinking with friends instead of spending it with them or with their partners. So it kind of caused a conflict and it would end up being a fight. And also that when they are away with friends, their partners would see that as they're spending time with other women and then they're spending that money with other women instead of spending with them, and then there'll be conflict around that. There's also masculine control in intimate relationships. So as they said that they've experienced violence in their lives previously or growing up, so they also see violence as an effective or legitimate tool to discipline and control their girlfriends who might resist their masculine authority. So coming back home, there are certain expectations as a man that the girlfriend might need to do. If they're not doing it, then they are resisting the authority, the masculine authority of maybe doing those things for their men. Then they see violence as the best option to solve that problem. And then while focusing on that, but there's also a wider context of violence in KZN and that of HIV. So we looked back that in the world, in the 1980s and 90s, there was a political violence in KZN. There was civil war between the two opposing political parties, which is the ANC and the IFP. People were forced to move from their homes. Some were forced to move into informal settlements. There's also violence in informal settlements, which is not adequately addressed. There's continued violence all the time, men fighting with other men, men abusing or fighting or abusing their partners. So there's constant violence in these communities, which is not adequately addressed by the structures that are in the communities, like the CPFs. And also we need to remember that this is a generation, some of them young men are from the generation where their parents were wiped out by the AIDS epidemic. So most of them were left as orphans, living with extended families. Some were displaced and moved around, maybe to go and live in informal settlement because there's a family member or a relative that lives in those spaces. So they've been moved around between two different relatives. And then as a result of that, some of them felt like there's lack of care. No one cares for them, and then they've been abandoned, as some of the men were living alone in these areas. So in addressing these challenges, we worked with these young men or young people in Teguini to co-develop a theory of change, which formed or enabled us and them to develop this intervention, which focused on their livelihoods as there's high unemployment in these areas, their mental health as they reported high levels of stress or in their lives, and improving communication with their girlfriend or partners. And then they were like, especially the focus on the I statement, which is roughly positive communication, and the importance of friends, because that is where they get the support from. In most times as they live alone or they don't have enough relationships with their parents or families. So in conclusion, we've discovered that, or we've seen that there is high violence in these areas in informal settlements between men and other men, and also towards like intimate partner violence. We also saw that through the court development process to provide some insights into the causes of violence, as men were telling us what causes violence in their lives and in general and in their relationships. And they were able to identify spaces for change and see how that change can take place in their lives and also within their peers. Next week, what we'll do is, in the next webinar next week, it's where we'll be focusing on the intervention itself with this year, Stepping Stones Creating Futures Plus. So thank you to the research team from the SMRC, University College London, University of Exeter, the research team from Project Empower, and our YPRAs, the Youth Peer Research Assistants. Thank you.
Great, thanks ever so much, Relay, for that and the set it kind of starting off. So now I want to hand over to Nwabisa, who will kind of continue this discussion about what makes these spaces so particularly challenging. So over to you, Nwabi.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Sivuyile, because I'm hoping that we can, refer to the background that Sivuyile has already given. Please confirm that my screen is now.
We can see your screen, yes, and we can hear you well, and that's perfect now. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to be referring to the social context of young people in the Siyaphambili Youth Project. Good afternoon, everyone. So Sivuyile has gone through the background and some of the challenges that young people in South Africa are facing generally, but also those living in marginalized communities face even more challenges, particularly poverty and high levels of unemployment, poor mental health and substance misuse, and lack of states' engagement in terms of supporting them through these kinds of challenges. So what we did for this presentation was to analyze how and compare between the urban and the urban and the rural contexts, to look at some of the aspects of the social context within which young people were living in eThekwini, informal settlements, as well as in a rural community in north of KZN, to see how their social contexts shape the syndemic risks for intimate partner violence, HIV risk, and substance misuse, as well as other experiences. So we did a qualitative exploration of the part that Sivuyile mentioned, referred to the artifacts and interviews of the young people that were involved in the project, in the co-development of the project. These were 17 young people who were working in the project, as Sivuyile described, to inform an understanding of the young people's lives as well as challenges. So 4 were men and women in the rural setting, and 5 were men and 4 were women in an urban setting. So they were ages 18 to 29 years old. Many had passed a matric, which is high school, but some had not finished. So what we focused on in our scope of inquiry was around the meanings that young people attached to the artifacts that they took, the pictures of their different experiences, to look at what was enabling or hindering in terms of their experiences. And we also locate this data around the time of the COVID-19 lockdown in South Africa, which was an interrupter. So what I will be looking at is focusing on Campbell and Cornish's conceptualization of social context, which look at the symbolic, material, and relational experiences that may explain the issues that young people are facing. Without repeating what Sivuyile mentioned, I'm just going to just say that interpersonal violence seemed to be a widespread practice, which mostly was reported around men's use of violence against other men, as well as against female partners in both the rural and the urban setting. And young people described the violence as problematic, but this was observed more in the urban setting, where also criminal elements were also involved. And what young people also described in the urban setting was the use of extreme community violence, particularly in situations where violence was used to avenge family members who had been victimized either through muggings or stabbings, which was, and the violence was used as a kind of a symbolic means of punishing or teaching criminals a lesson, or to claim a family's dignity, which they perceived to have been undermined through whatever act of violence against their family member. And in comparison to the urban setting, young people in the rural setting, they describe their communities as relatively non-violent, despite well-known incidents of violence like femicide, and some young people reserved notions that their communities were weak, and if a community doesn't use violence to punish perpetrators, then they are unable to prevent further violence. Around the symbolic context, again, young people spoke about, particularly young men, spoke about intimate partner perpetration, where young men in both settings seemed to be rejecting the use of violence against women. And some of them also distanced themselves from it, and they saw it as unjustifiable behavior. And some of the young men also saw it as a perpetration of violence against women as an inappropriate expression of real manhood, and questioned those the socialization of those young men who perpetrated violence against women. In terms of women's reported victimization, well, many of the women believed, especially in the urban setting, believed that intimate partner violence was common, but few reported it. And they cited drivers such as women's financial independence, as rather dependence on male partners, and tolerance of violence because of the support they receive. But they also mentioned male partners controlling behavior and heavy alcohol drinking. So there were instances where women would explain what happened with their friends, and only 2 women spoke about their personal experiences of violence. And some of the parts around the explanations of these drivers was that, for instance, tolerance of violence was explained as having, or as occurring because young people attached it to notions of love, that's a man's expression of his love. And women reportedly stayed in abusive relationships because they were financially dependent, and men used this as control. And there's one woman, Nonsindiso, in an urban setting, who reported how she experienced that the financial dependence and the financial support by the partner, as well as the control, but she got out of that relationship eventually. So another context which Sivuyile has already mentioned is the symbolic nature of men's participation in multiple partnering, which they linked to a notion of manhood. Also, they linked it to their historical practice of polygamy that associates men with higher, or accrues men a higher social status among other men. And these young men spoke about multiple partnering as a way to access a symbol of being a top dog, a guy who is living life in his own on his own terms. But some also spoke about a multiple partnering as a way to access sexual pleasure. So there were also women who reported the complicity in multiple partnering, where, for instance, it was framed as women who deliberately date men that they know are dating other women, and they do so in order to undermine those women's relationships. And women whose partners had reportedly cheated on them talked about the emotional hurt that they had gone through. And here, this brings me to the women's own practices of multiple partnering, where women spoke about their decision to have a side partner in order to help them to manage the disappointment that they experience from cheating partners. And it was very common for women not to dump men who have, when they realize or find out that they are dating other women. And so women then some women talked about having a side partner in order to manage the emotional hurt, or to never, put their trust in a partner. And so they would rather avoid disappointment by also having fun with other partners. And men and women also criticize men for being disrespectful, especially for being caught, and they praise themselves, women, for being good at hiding their side partners from either the side partner or the main partner when they were cheating. Another aspect of what was taking place in terms of the social context, there was a lot reported around women's exposure to sexual harassment. And the sexual harassment was reportedly taking place within a context where men would be seeking to date women, whether they know them from the community or they meet them in the street. But then after, in some instances, women were exposed to sexual harassment when they rejected these men were proposing them. These men sought to diminish the young women's self-esteem by using verbal, physical, or sexual assault. And so these two extracts are just examples of the ways in which women are exposed, both in the rural and the urban setting, to men who harassed them, and if they refused, then wanted to teach them a lesson, or to deal with what they called their arrogance. In Nokutobeka's case, in the urban setting, there was some mention of women experiencing a rape, but a few women spoke about this as something that they had either experienced or something that had happened in kind of close proximity with them. Another notion that I just wanted to quickly go through is another issue is women's use of violence. So in both settings, women spoke about, and both men and women spoke about women using violence against other women to exert power over them, especially when they believed that these women were undermining them. And there are two contexts in which women described being undermined: when a woman was dating their boyfriend, or when a woman gossiped about them. And sometimes they spoke of women fighting when they were sharing a transactional sexual partner, but that was kind of a different context, and not women who were participating in the study. So we need time to understand what that was about. But here it was women who physically would engage in fights in order to then address whatever issues that they had with other women, and it involved women sometimes supporting each other in ensuring that that other woman was taught a lesson. Alcohol was seen as a vehicle that justified the use of violence, especially by men, and it also highlighted some of the sexual risk-taking that sometimes men engaged in, but also women in the context of transactional sex. But also there was some excusing of some violence that men perpetrated under the influence of under the influence of alcohol, where young men spoke about men unintentionally using violence, and therefore not understanding the impact of their behavior because they were under the influence. And so we could see that there was some of those, that understanding, but alcohol seemed to be quite common in many aspects of young people's lives, whether it was about having fun or in dealing with some of their challenges. And it's the alcohol use, or the challenges of men's use of violence seemed to abate during the times when alcohol was banned. So I'm nearly finished. So just going through the material context now, all participants highlighted that the COVID lockdown period was very challenging for them, especially as many lost jobs, could not access new livelihood opportunities, could not engage in further studies, or even to apply for new opportunities as well. And here, what we also saw was that young men especially reported how job losses also challenged the gendered social expectations on them to provide for their children and partners. And this seemed to apply also for young men who could not even pay rent as well, besides just supporting their partners. And there was a lot of a talk around passing matric, which seemed to be to represent high achievement for some families, especially in the rural setting, where it meant that the family had an opportunity to progress. Sometimes one would be the first person to have passed matric, and this passing matric was then seen as a way for young people to access further education, which could lead to sustainable jobs and opportunities. And the time around which we collected data seemed to interrupt some of those further endeavors for young people. And for those who failed matric, then they sought other ways to either repeat or to seek further opportunities. In terms of the relational context, young people spoke of their community as they kind of spoke about the social support that they received in their communities, especially in the rural setting. The urban setting seemed to be quite challenged due to some of the criminal elements that young people reported. And they also reflected, although there was some social support among those who were friends, but there was a reflection of the kind of criminal activity that took place in their communities, influencing the trust deficit among community members, where especially young men would be exposed and would be distrusted and sometimes accused of theft, and sometimes, of course, as I had mentioned earlier, that there was also extreme, community responses, for example, to punish perceived wrongdoers. And so that's mostly how they spoke about the relationships in the community. For family settings, yes, the young people reported mixed accounts about the nature of their family relationships. Most of them spoke about good relationships with parents, but there were some complications that they reported. And urban young men seemed to live without families compared to those who were in the rural setting. And so they had few reported daily interactions with their families. And mothers were seen as supportive and nurturing, and fathers were mostly seen as role models for the young men and strict protectors for the young women. Young people's friendships were close and vibrant, emotionally supportive through different life challenges. They hung out together, played games, sometimes drank together. Young women plaited each other's hair, and this provided them a space to discuss any issues that they were experiencing, and also to receive support. And around the job losses, many young men spoke and reflected empathy and support for those who had lost jobs. And so they spoke of how sometimes they would come together, or they were express more understanding towards the challenges other young people were facing. Now, to close my presentation. I'd just like to highlight from these findings that young people's social contexts are marked in the study by high levels of interpersonal violence, especially men's use of violence, mostly in the urban setting. And there's little understanding of women's use of violence against other women. And then there's also this issue of this unresolved or unresolvable influence of multiple partnering in relationships, which now seems to also be shaping women's own sexual risk-taking as it does also with young men. Alcohol drinking seems to be central to many of the aspects of social life, including risk-taking as well as exposure to violence for young people. We just need to understand and explore a bit more around the psychosocial effects of the lockdown and how it undermined young people's livelihoods, and perhaps look at recovery in terms of the intervention that Sivile is going to be talking about next week. And just to close and say that young people reflected a social support in their relationships, and more so in the rural than in the urban setting, which suggests that young men in particular may not be enjoying such a supportive relationships. And just to acknowledge participants, the YPRAs in the project, and everyone in the team. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Noabi. So that's great. Really of helping us think about how social contexts shape young people's lives. Now we will shift from South Africa to India, and Nareen, over to you to speak about a very similar context. So look forward to hearing from you. While Nareen's just getting that up, remember to post any questions in the chat box.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I am going to share about women's experiences of violence in informal settlement of Mumbai. Sneha is an organization, a non-profit organization, working to break the intergenerational cycle of poor health and violence against women and children. Our mission is to work in partnerships with communities and public systems to ensure evidence-based, effective models on prevention of violence. We essentially work in urban informal settlements. UN Habitat has defined the definition of UN Habitat of urban informal settlements include poor structural quality of housing, as you can see over here, overcrowding, inadequate access to safe water, inadequate access to sanitation, and insecure residential status. Obviously, we all know women and children become vulnerable to these environments. This is a recent estimate in 22 about lifetime prevalence and past year prevalence of physical or sexual violence. And if you see Asia, the estimates in Asia are pretty high. So the issue has been long going on, and people are trying really to see what can be done. I want to bring in my co-panelists and talk about men. I want to bring in here the lens of mental health and violence against women and girls. And the mental health, there are millions and millions of women who are defined with mental health conditions, but there are again millions of women who are in difficult situations and due to differences in gender roles, due to exposure to stressors in life and difference in responsibilities, resultantly leading to domestic violence and other forms of violence. Violence against women and mental health intersect, and in our experience, I don't think we can do interventions separately when we talk about violence against women and girls. So globally, interventions that have been prominently recommended are primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention, which go together when we talk about prevention strategies. Our experience, although our Sneha works on violence against women and children, I think our experience of the more than 2 decades has been that women report all forms of violence. And I know WHO has recommended physical and sexual forms of violence, but what we see a lot in these areas is gender-based household maltreatment, which constitutes neglect, economic and emotional violence. In fact, women's narratives have been more about how they really get their mental health really gets affected with these aspects. I want to show you a little bit of data of the women assessed at our counseling centers in our project. And what we really see, they're assessed on depression and anxiety using PHQ-9 and GAT-7. And what you really see is 47% of women have reported moderate to severe depression, and 33% have reported moderate to severe anxiety. Now, I'm in no way saying that they inherently have mental health conditions, but sometimes long periods of abuse, ambivalence in relationships definitely sees this kind of an impact on women and girls. Here on the right, what you see is there are different behaviors that constitute economic abuse. And on the left in the chart, what you see is with each behavior increasing, there is a possibility of depression and anxiety being higher in survivors of violence. Similarly, with coercive control, we see 71% of women have reported coercive control. And this is not now. Over the years, we see this trend. And on the right again, you see behaviors that include coercive control. And on the left, what you again see is with each behavior added, women have talked about the chances of depression and anxiety have been higher. Our model, and we have really understood over the years that if we really want to work on prevention of violence against women and children, that we need to work with the socio-economic model, which constitutes community mobilization, secondary prevention, which is once the violence has happened, how do you really help the survivor, irrespective of whether the survivor comes to the counseling center or the survivor is then within communities by our volunteers. And the third, which is again very important, is that strengthening institutional response. In a country like ours, I think NGOs have been doing this work for decades and decades, but we have been really trying how to build in more accountability with the institutions. These are a range of psychosocial interventions that are provided to women and children at the community level, which comprises of group education, interpersonal activities, individual volunteerism. At individual level, we deal with distress reduction, suicide prevention, and many other mental health and counseling interventions, and reintegrating these women back into the community. And at the institutional level, as I said, there's co-creating protocols with public health systems, police, in order, and one-stop centers, in order to see that women and children are helped and a coordinated response is provided. What we see happening with these kind of psychosocial interventions provided, increased mobility of women. Definitely women who have not been mobile for years have kind of reported increased mobility through narratives, through qualitative interviews, and through our data. Individual identity, there is a sense of individual identity through volunteerism. Social identity develops through expansion of reference groups. These groups are very important because gives them a reference in which they situate themselves and increase well-being. This is an interesting chart when you see what women really expect. And most, if you see the expectations of women expect safety for themselves, for their children. Women expect emotional support, and they want to learn about options they have in a situation in urban informal settlement where options are very few. Negotiate to stop violence is one which we see all the time, and protection. They want protection from further abuse. They don't want to be abused, and they want a respectable position in their family. This, again, this is very much related to mental health conditions, and we see these 5 kinds of risks as priority, which women have said: physical risk of assault, escalation in violence, and assaulted by weapon threat. Women have reported a lot of threats being given to them when it comes to, and that really poses a risk and a lot of distress in them when we see them. Risk at home of being more abused, risk of mobility, not being allowed to be mobile, and risk of illness, which also includes mental health conditions. We were very interested, having a program for many years. We were very interested in really trying to integrate violence interventions with mental health interventions. And as I said, they go so much together. But violence interventions are very time consuming. And that is why somewhere, somehow, mental health interventions remain at the back burner. Through a multi-site entry research project, we have developed a package of care called the Garima package of care for survivors of violence to really look at an integrated approach of mental health and violence intervention. And this is a web-based resource to be used by anyone who is interested in learning at all levels, at the prevention level, at the addressing level. This is the menu of the Garima package of care. We have structured the package into 3 consultations along with a get ready section of social interventions. How do you really educate the woman on her life, and link additional modules on how do you really go about with the survivor of violence and with women in the community. Our recommendations from this work that we have done for all these years is a multifaceted, intersectional psychosocial approach to prevention is very, very important. Of course, the approach has to acknowledge the impact of socio-political and cultural backgrounds and contexts where we work. Programs that should focus, wherever prevention programs should really focus and need to frame in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention, because otherwise you're leaving out one intervention and you're focusing on the other. And programs for prevention of violence against women and girls require a multidisciplinary team who can really deal at a range of psychosocial interventions to prevent violence against women and girls and also restore their mental health. So thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Nyreen. Sorry about butting in at the end. Really interesting to hear the similar kind of challenges and experiences you've had. And now hand over to Rachel for some general comments about these kind of bigger questions about the kind of high levels of violence. So Rachel.
So thank you very much. It's, you know, as Andy said, it's been extremely interesting getting the opportunity to compare and contrast these snapshots of life from different parts of South Africa, rural and urban, in KwaZulu-Natal province, as well as against the research in Mumbai. Very different setting, but very similar challenges that are being posed there. So I think that, you know, our key question is, how do we understand this? You know, clearly we have very different cultural contexts. We always think of culture as playing a role in violence against women, and it has a very important role, but trying to tease out what that is and how it sits alongside the contribution of different structural factors, I think is incredibly important. I have got one slide, and I'll just try and share my screen so that I can show it. I just thought it was helpful as part of part of providing a bit of a brief discussion. So what I've got here is a slide looking at drivers of intimate partner violence, and this comes from an article that Andy first authored, but we all produced, that was one of the key outputs from the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls global program in the first phase. And it was really a reassessment of what we understand by the drivers of violence. And this image that we put together and discuss in this paper on new learnings around violence, drivers of violence, I think is incredibly useful because of its simplicity. And what we've done is to try and highlight the way in which you have this dynamic relationship between structural factors and individual and relationship factors driving intimate partner violence. And we've seen in this discussion this morning, all of these structural factors. We're looking at very impoverished areas, whether rural, as in South Africa, or urban, as in Mumbai and eThekwini. And we see poverty as an absolutely key driver of violence. And I think that Sibuyile has provided some really insightful comments based on the data from South Africa on how poverty operates. What are the mechanisms through which poverty leads to increased violence? And obviously, central amongst the structural factors, or the leading structural factor, is gender inequality. And this may take different forms in some respects in Mumbai from in South Africa, but the essential elements of patriarchal privilege and the disempowerment of women are common to the two areas, as we've seen in this discussion. And one of the other structural factors highlighted here is the normative use of violence. And I think this is sometimes a factor that isn't emphasized so much when the discussions come from some other global regions. But you really see in these very impoverished areas that violence against women, the intimate partner violence, is just one of the forms of violence that's experienced within the community. We've heard a lot of emphasis about men fighting with other men, and we know that that's seen as being a men's competition and use of violence with other men is very much linked to dominant ideas of hegemonic masculinity in so many places. And we've also seen, interestingly, in Wabisa's presentation, a discussion of women fighting with other women, which again shows the way in which in South Africa violence is normative in so many aspects of social relations. And it's not just linked to gendered violence in terms of intimate partner violence, but it very much feeds into that. And again, Sibuyile has highlighted the experiences men talked about of trauma that they experienced in their childhood, of witnessing what we call intergenerational cycling of violence experienced by their mothers when they were growing up and children. And this obviously has a huge impact on the psyche, the mental health of boys as they grow up into adults and then perform their adults' lives. But it also feeds into and is a key part of this normative use of violence, as well as being a demonstration of patriarchal privilege and gender inequality, male dominance over women within, which is experienced from a very young age within communities. And on this slide, we also really highlight poor mental health and substance abuse. Substance abuse has been a key feature of the discussions from Sibuyile and Nwabisa in particular, and poor mental health have cut across all of the conversations. And we know that not only does experience of violence severely negatively impact mental health, and in itself can be a driver of substance abuse, but if people have poor mental health, particularly PTSD and depression, much more likely to perpetrate violence. And I think we've seen that very nicely played out in the discussions today. I also highlight on this slide poor communication and relationship conflict responses. And I think it's very important to have that there, because we have to remember that even within these very impoverished settings, there are households where there is not intimate partner violence. And there are households where many of these factors pertain without intimate partner violence. So it's very important to be able to start thinking in a drill down way of what might differentiate those homes from other homes. And actually poor communication and relationship conflict responses is one of the amenable factors for our interventions, as well as obviously trying to strengthen mental health and reduce substance abuse and to change views on gender equality and the position of women. But it's very important that we keep this in the frame, because we do know that interventions that maybe don't make so much difference to some of the other risk factors can be very helpful if they do impact on communication and relationship conflict responses. So I think it's really important to highlight that. And then this slide also points to the overarching impact of conflict, post-conflict. And we've talked a bit about that, particularly Sibuyile highlighted it in his presentation, and whether low-level community unrest or actually open conflict, it feeds into the whole context of undermined mental health, instability, sort of precariousness of life in terms of economic status, and the normative use of violence. So I just want to share this and use this as providing a framework. And I think it's important for us then to take comments and questions on the presentation. So I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Great, thanks Rachel for that, and for giving a really good overview and a synthesis, and kind of giving a positive kind of focus on where we need to think about. Unfortunately, we've actually run out of time, which is one thing I've just noticed. So there were some good questions, and a lot of the questions relate to kind of interventions and thinking around how do we address this. And so I'm going to have to say, can we actually answer those at the next webinar, which is next week, where we will have more time for question, where we're really shifting these questions on from what's the problem. Irene had already started talking about how do we intervene and address things. But at the next one next week, we'll be talking really about how do we intervene and address, and can we kind of work on those things which are amenable. So apologies that we have run out of questions. So I just want to finish by thanking Sibuyile, Nwabisa, Irene and Rachel for their valuable input and significant contribution to this. Got a link to an evaluation form which should be added to the chat. And the next webinar, where we will have more time, we'll make sure there's time for questions and discussion, is on the 19th of June, so next week. at 2 o'clock Southern African time. So please keep an eye out on social media for that information. And for those of you who've missed any part of this webinar or wish to revisit it, as we said at the start, this will be uploaded to the Sia Pambile Youth YouTube channel. And once again, thank you all for your participation. Apologies for running over. We look forward to welcoming you to the next webinar. So goodbye for now.